Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Salovey, the president of Yale University. You know, I love the fact that that line still gathers applause. You know, there will come a day when it won't. Well, on behalf of the trustees of Yale University, the faculty, and everyone here at Yale and in the New Haven community, it's my honor to introduce Ambassador Samantha Power. Ambassador Power is here on campus today as a Chubb Fellow. Hendon Chubb was a 1895 graduate of Yale's Sheffield Scientific School, and in 1936, he made a substantial gift to the university to encourage our students to take an interest in public service. Since 1949, his endowment has been used to underwrite a prestigious visiting speakers program bringing extraordinary public figures to the campus. The fellowship is administered by the Master of Timothy Dwight College, who is currently Jeffrey Brunzell, who you will see later in the program. Past Chubb Fellows have included 4 presidents of the United States, presidents of 8 other countries, and more than 150 other regionally, nationally, and internationally prominent individuals noted for their distinction in service to the common good. I'm especially delighted to introduce Ambassador Power today for 2 reasons. First, we are celebrating her homecoming. She earned her bachelor's degree in history from Yale in 1992. And I found that one of the great pleasures I don't know if those are all the history majors or the class of 1992, but we found one of the greatest pleasures and privileges in the Yale presidency is the opportunity to welcome back graduates who have distinguished themselves in the world. In this particular case, I confess to having a personal stake in the outcome. Ambassador Power was a student in my psychology class. I don't know whether she has been able to apply anything that she actually learned in that class in the years since, but I'm happy now, perhaps happier than she might have been at the time, to make careful note of the fact that she was one of my students. The second reason is it is a special pleasure to welcome Ambassador Power today is that collectively Yale owes her a debt of gratitude. I would put it this way. She has chosen to do with her life what we aspire to prepare all of our students to do. She has taken maximal advantage, both here and elsewhere, of the privileged educational opportunities that her capacities and circumstances presented to her, and she has fully embraced these opportunities in order to accomplish extraordinary things, both with respect to the life of the mind and to the life of the world. Most of you know that Ambassador Power has combined in an unusual and powerful way the careers of an academic and a public servant. While in law school at Harvard, she began writing a paper that became her Pulitzer Prize-winning and immensely influential book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, published in 2002. It has been said of this book that it influenced more young people, and in particular more women, to devote themselves to studying and working in human rights than any work published before or since. In an often told story, we know that the book also moved the then junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, to meet her for dinner. From there, her story accelerates. Staff member to Senator Obama, foreign policy advisor to the presidential campaign, special assistant to the president, and senior director for multilateral affairs and human rights. U.S. permanent representative to the United Nations, the youngest ever at age 43. And throughout her rapid rise to positions of accountability and influence, Samantha Power has demonstrated a remarkable commitment to probing the often troubling relationship between the prerogatives of power and the obligations of power. Here at Yale, we are grateful and honored to have her as a member of our community, where once she came to study in our classrooms, today she has returned to offer us her own instruction and wisdom. Please join me in extending to her our own warm welcome back to Yale, Ambassador Power. Thank you so much for being here. So nice to be here.
Thank you. This is not the welcome I get when I walk into the UN Security Council every morning. I should come here more often. It's wonderful, truly wonderful, very moving for me to be back. I came to Yale from Atlanta, Georgia. I went to a public high school in Atlanta, Georgia. And being here, it is no overstatement to say that being here completely changed my life. It was an amazing experience. Many of my teachers are here who I still think about, even as I do my day job. I went from wanting to be a sportscaster, which would have been a very worthy career, and still I pine for it at times, to wanting to do something, anything in American foreign policy because of the teaching and the inspiration that I got from the Yale faculty and from my fellow classmates. I will say that I never, ever, ever, ever imagined that I would come back to Yale to speak as the UN ambassador, so it's thrilling for me. Thank you. We are living in a time, it is very fair to say, of daunting and perpetual crises. The deadly spread of Ebola in West Africa, a string of shocking executions by ISIL, more tanks and heavy armaments rolling across Ukraine's border to Russian-backed separatists, barrel bombs and chlorine being dropped by the Assad regime on Syrian civilians, child soldiers being abducted and forced to fight in a brutal civil war in the world's newest country, South Sudan. The list goes on and on. There's so many crises that when we turn our attention to working to bring one of these under control or trying to reduce the suffering that a particular crisis is causing, two more pop up. At a different time in our history, we may have felt tempted to ignore some of these threats. We may have thought that we wouldn't pay a price. In 1776, Thomas Paine wrote that, quote, "America, remote from all the wrangling of the world, may live at ease. Bounded by the ocean and backed by the wilderness, what hath she to fear but her God?" End quote. But in today's interconnected world, we don't have the luxury of remoteness from the world's wrangling. It can impact us more swiftly and more deeply than ever before. Now, this is not news to any of you. You see it, you feel it, you understand that America cannot afford to ignore these threats. And at the same time, you understand that today's threats are so immense and so complex that even if the United States wanted to tackle any one of them alone, we would not be able to do so. We need to rally the international community to our side. The point I want to make to you today is that in addition to leading the international community in responding to these threats in real time, we need to help shape a world where such threats are less likely to arise in the first place. This sounds so obvious, I know, and yet generations of policymakers across the political spectrum have struggled to dedicate the bandwidth, financial resources, and diplomatic and political capital to make these long-term investments. As someone who came into government fully convinced of the critical importance of seeing beyond the crisis of the moment, I can tell you that it is surprisingly challenging in practice to do so, given all else. But my message to you today is that we cannot treat the short and long term as an either-or proposition. We have to try to put out a lot of fires in the here and now, but we can't let the immediacy of today's crises distract us from playing a smart, long game that will create more stability and more security in the long run. Let me offer a few examples. Curbing the spread of Ebola, protecting the rights of women and girls, and countering violent extremism. On September 18th, the United States chaired the first ever emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on a public health crisis, Ebola. By that time, more than 2,500 people had died of the virus, and some 5,500 had been reported infected in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. A Liberian healthcare worker named Jackson Niema, who was working at Médecins Sans Frontières, Ebola clinic in the capital of Monrovia, spoke to the council via video link. He described people dying outside the gates of the clinic where he worked because there were just no more beds to take them in. He said, quote, "I feel that the future of my country is hanging in the balance. If the international community does not stand up, we will be wiped out," end quote. Now, the United States has done more than any other country to help West Africa respond to the Ebola crisis. The CDC deployed teams to the region way back in March, shortly after the outbreak began. In July, President Obama declared controlling the epidemic a national security priority. And most importantly, days before that September Security Council meeting, the president announced the largest global health intervention in U.S. history, resulting so far in the deployment of more than 3,000 U.S. civilian and military personnel from the Department of Defense, USAID, the CDC, and other agencies. We're supporting the construction of 15 Ebola treatment units, so-called ETUs, and brave and brilliant men and women in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps provide Ebola treatment at a 25-bed hospital built by the U.S. military and dedicated to treating healthcare workers and Ebola responders who contract the virus. This ensures that medical volunteers and UN personnel from around the world will receive top-notch care if they are infected while working on the front lines of this epidemic. The United States is training hundreds of Liberian healthcare workers at a newly built center in Monrovia, and countless more through mobile training teams traveling to remote areas. But even with all this, we know that the United States alone cannot curb the epidemic's deadly spread. That's why we mobilized 133 other countries, the most in the history of the United Nations, to co-sponsor a Security Council resolution declaring Ebola a threat to international peace and security. It's why President Obama personally launched a full-court press to mobilize commitments from other countries, keeping heads of state around the world on speed dial to convince them to do more. And it is why we are now holding other countries to the commitments that they have made and pressing those who have committed too little or who've committed nothing at all to do their part, because we will not defeat Ebola with a some hands on deck effort. Having visited the most affected countries at the end of October, I can tell you that we are beginning to see the impact of our collective response. In Bong County, Liberia, I visited a U.S. Navy-run Ebola testing lab, which had cut the time local Liberians waited for test results from 5 days to between 3 and 5 hours. On November 4th, only 33 out of 53 Ebola-affected districts across the region had the ability to transport samples to a lab within 24 hours of collecting them, according to the WHO. By November 17th, just 13 days later, all 53 districts had that capability. And lab testing time matters, because the sooner you get your results, the sooner you can leave facilities where you might be waiting with people who are actually infected. And in many of these labs, about 70% of the results are coming back negative. So actually, a large number of people who are being tested are not those who in fact have Ebola. They may have malaria, they may have some other ailment. It allows them to leave, and it frees up bed space for those who need to be isolated with Ebola. The results affirm what we have said all along about Ebola, which is that we know how to win this fight. We can bend Ebola's deadly curve, but bending that curve is very different from ending it. It would be a huge mistake to think that just because we are seeing signs of progress in some areas, that we are close to stopping this outbreak. We are not. In Sierra Leone, the disease is spreading faster than at any time since the outbreak began, with more than 900 new infections reported in the 2-week period that ended November 23rd. Some 16,000 people have been reported infected in West Africa, and more than 5,500 people have died. The actual figures are likely, in fact, to be much higher. Local contact tracing teams outside of capitals, which are critical to breaking chains of transmission, continue to lack basic resources like gas for their motorcycles, or even credit for their SIM cards on their cell phones. And the human toll is staggering. Think for a second about the heartbreak associated with any one of the 4,000 boys and girls who have lost a mother or father to the virus. 4,000 orphans. Or the incalculable loss of warmth in countries where people used to hug when they met, but now are told not to wipe the tears from the eyes of a sick child in case the child might be infected. Or the pain experienced by the people who have beaten the virus, only to find themselves stigmatized or even run out of town by their friends and their communities when they attempt to go home. Yet in spite of all the suffering the outbreak has caused, and it is immense, and in spite of the virus's surge in parts of the affected countries, we have to find a way to look beyond the outbreak and ask what factors made these countries so vulnerable. We have to take steps now so that in the long term, we avoid finding ourselves in this situation again. One reason Ebola spread so fast was because West Africa had never experienced an Ebola outbreak before. And even before the virus surfaced, public health systems in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone were stretched beyond capacity just to meet the day-to-day needs of their citizens. Prior to the outbreak, Liberia had approximately 50 doctors for the entire country of 4.3 million people. That's around 1 doctor for every 100,000 people. Sierra Leone had 2 doctors for every 100,000 people. The United States, by contrast, has 245 doctors for every 100,000 people. The United Kingdom has 279, Germany 380. Yale New Haven Hospital, which is just one of nearly 50 hospitals in Connecticut alone, has more than 600 resident physicians. Liberia, 50, before Ebola. The Yale New Haven number is 12 times the number of doctors in all of pre-Ebola Liberia. The Yale School of Medicine graduates over 10 times the number of doctors in a single class than worked in Liberia before Ebola began taking some of the country's best nurses and doctors. Ebola has killed approximately 330 healthcare workers in West Africa, many of whom were not working to treat Ebola when they were infected, but rather were providing routine medical assistance, such as delivering babies. The affected countries also lacked, and in many instances continue to lack, protective suits and even plastic gloves to keep healthcare workers safe. They lack lab capacity, emergency operations centers, and disease surveillance systems. Communities were not aware, and some are still not aware, of what Ebola is or how it is spread. All of these deficiencies meant that when the Ebola outbreak hit these countries, it hit harder and spread faster. Leaders and communities in the region understand the importance of plugging these gaps. They understand the dangerous short-sightedness of thinking our job is done when we end the current outbreak. They know what epidemiologists' research proves: another outbreak, whether of Ebola or of another deadly disease like SARS or MERS, is inevitable. But whether these outbreaks become full-blown epidemics is up to us. When I met with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia on my trip to the region and asked her what keeps her up at night, she said it was the country's restless youth. 3/4 of Liberia's population is under the age of 35. She said she worried about kids who've been out of school for months, about young men and women who've lost their jobs since Liberia's economy started its ongoing decline. 1 out of every 2 Liberians who was employed at the beginning of the outbreak is now out of work. 7 in 10 people surveyed said they do not have enough money to buy food. President Condé of Guinea and President Koroma of Sierra Leone voiced similar concerns. So did so many of the community and civil society leaders I met with in all 3 countries. They were worried that making it to Ebola-free will quickly translate into these countries being assistance-free, as we in the international community quickly pack up and leave behind countries with far greater insecurity and far weaker economies, with thousands of orphan children and public institutions in shambles. Recognizing these acute risks, we are now looking beyond ending this Ebola epidemic's curve to preventing the next infectious disease epidemic. Back in February, before the first cases of Ebola in Guinea came to light, the United States launched the Global Health Security Agenda, the GHSA. The agenda is aimed at preparing countries to prevent, detect, and rapidly respond to outbreaks before they become epidemics. During a meeting with President Obama in September, 43 countries joined us in announcing over 100 specific commitments to strengthen global health security, together with the WHO and other international institutions. The GHSA is predicated on the understanding that in a world where an outbreak that begins in the forests of Guinea can quickly spread across borders, continents, and even oceans, a weakness in any part of our interconnected global health security system is a threat to us all. We and our partners have set out 11 areas of focus to strengthen national, regional, and global capacity. These include boosting immunization rates to stop the resurgence of preventable diseases, ensuring countries have nationwide lab systems capable of conducting rapid, accurate tests to detect outbreaks early, and developing and implementing the real-time disease surveillance systems and the workforce required to track outbreaks, like the contact tracing teams that are so critical to tracking down those who might have had physical contact with someone infected with Ebola. Each area of focus within the GHSA has a 5-year implementation plan which sets out concrete benchmarks along the way and a way to measure them. To meet crises head-on where they are, we are also developing new regional partners, such as the African Union's own Centers for Disease Control, which the AU and the United States agreed to jointly create during this year's US-Africa Leaders Summit, and our own CDC is helping to advise and build. We're also investing in the young policymakers, innovators, and civil society leaders who will lead their countries in responding not only to this kind of crisis, but other crises. Whether inside or outside of government, these individuals will do the yeoman's work of shoring up institutions and making societies more resilient and less vulnerable to global threats like epidemics. This is why President Obama launched the Young African Leaders Initiative, which brought its first class of 500 Mandela Washington Fellows to the United States to study this past summer. 20 of our nation's top universities, including Yale, I'm proud to say, hosted Mandela Washington Fellows for 6 weeks of leadership training, skill building, and networking with their peers. Some of you in the audience may have had the chance to hear from these fellows about their remarkable work, often done in the most daunting circumstances. One of the Mandela Washington Fellows in this year's class was Sarah McGill, a 28-year-old Liberian. When Sarah returned home this fall, she noticed a problem. Because of the exponential spread of Ebola, when Sarah went shopping in Monrovia, all the stores had signs outside telling people to wash their hands in chlorinated water before entering. Most shops had a 5-liter bucket outside, and at the busier businesses, the wait could take up to 10 minutes. During that time, people crowded into long lines when they were at greater risk of infection. Others gave up and left, costing the stores business. So Sarah designed a simple 440-liter tank with 6 individual stations, which permit multiple people to wash their hands at once. And because the tank is much larger, it only needs to be refilled once a day as opposed to every few hours with smaller buckets. 16 communities are now using this simple tank that Sarah designed, and more plan to build them, particularly outside of schools, enabling potentially schools to open back up and the necessary precautions to be put in place. Investing in a problem solver like Sarah and all of the young problem solvers in this audience tonight has to be part of our long game. Now, I've been on campus for about 2.5 hours, and I've already gotten an administration's worth of policy recommendations today from Yale students and faculty. Thank you for that. But let me offer one to you, and to take advantage of the leadership who is present here today. I would urge you not only to host future classes of Mandela Washington Fellows, but also to deepen your engagement with the initiative by sending Yale students, faculty members, and researchers out into the field to partner with the fellows who have studied here. Dartmouth, which also hosted fellows in 2014, has started a program like this, and its first batch of students are on their way to Tanzania, Ghana, Angola, and Zimbabwe to work with fellows this winter. Of course, Ebola is not the only crisis where it is in America's interest and the world's to play the long game even as we respond to immediate threats. Another is advancing the rights of women and girls. We've got to address the immediate crisis of widespread gender-based violence, particularly in wartime, while at the same time making the crucial long-term investments in the empowerment of women and girls. Violence against women during conflicts is anything but a new problem. One of the earliest accounts of the mass abduction of women and girls can be found in Plutarch's Parallel Lives, where the seizure of Sabine women played a central part in the creation of Rome. Plutarch wrote, "Armed with swords, then, many of Romulus's followers kept their eyes intently upon him, and when the signal was given, drew their swords, rushed in with shouts, and ravished away the daughters of the Sabines." Some say that only 30 maidens were seized, and that from these the curae were named. But Valerius Antius puts the number at 527 and Juba at 683, all maidens. We know that violence against women and girls in conflicts persists with disturbing frequency, yet the statistics and the horrifying individual acts continue to shock. Consider the Democratic Republic of Congo, where sexual violence has long been used as a tactic of war in the decades-long conflict. In one of the most devastating incidents, at least 387 people, including 300 women and 55 girls, were raped by armed groups in 13 villages in eastern Congo between July 30th and August 2nd, 2010. Just a 3-day period. While conflicts exacerbate such violence, it is a daily fact of life for women and girls around the world. 1 in 3 women is the victim of physical or sexual violence in their lifetimes. The UN estimates that 150 million girls worldwide experience sexual violence each year. In Sao Paulo, Brazil's largest city, a woman is assaulted every 15 seconds, according to UN Women. And in many places, the problem is getting worse, not better. In Honduras, the number of violent deaths of women increased by 263% from 2005 to 2013. Yet in 95% of sexual violence crimes and killings of women in Honduras, the perpetrators are never punished. There are immediate steps we can take to stop violence against women and girls, both during conflicts and in peacetime. We can improve accountability for violence against women and girls through strengthening documentation of abuses and the capacity of justice officials to prosecute perpetrators. Physicians for Human Rights created a mobile app, Medicapt, which it piloted this year in the Congo, and which converts standardized medical intake forms into a way to gather forensic documentation for prosecutions. When a medical professional fills out the form using the app, it is immediately turned into a digital record which can be used by prosecutors to trace patterns and build cases against perpetrators. The app can be used with a digital camera, allowing medical professionals to supplement their written reports with photographs of key evidence, such as physical bruising. For this evidence to be useful, countries need prosecutors who are capable of building cases upon such evidence and judges with the independence to punish powerful perpetrators. Yet these are basic institutions that many countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, still lack. And this is why in June, Secretary Kerry announced a new accountability initiative to support specialized justice sector mechanisms, such as mobile courts, to improve access to justice for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in conflicts, and to help build the judicial capacity of partner governments. As you all know, the struggle for accountability must not only be waged in conflict zones like the Congo, but also here in the United States, including at our colleges and universities. An estimated 1 in 5 women has been sexually assaulted during her college years. Of those assaults, only 12% are reported, and of those reported assaults, only a fraction of the offenders are punished. That is why President Obama established the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault. In April, the task force released a report with recommended steps that schools can take to hold offenders accountable and support survivors. This struggle needs to be waged not only by women, but also by men. That's one of the messages behind the President's and Vice President's It's On Us campaign, launched recently to stop sexual assault on college campuses. As a proud Yale graduate, I'm often amazed by the leadership and the service of Yale students and graduates, but rarely am I as impressed as I have been with how students here have taken up this challenge, moving far beyond making a pledge to bringing together leaders from across campus. From Yale's College Council to communication and consent educators, from the Yale Women's Center to sports teams and a cappella groups, to build a campaign that makes everyone on this campus ask, how can we change our behavior and our community to live up to this pledge? How can we work with the administration to bring about stronger enforcement and accountability? How do we make this part of our Yale? That's exactly what It's On Us is all about. At the same time, far from U.S. campuses, we have to make UN peacekeepers better at protecting women and girls from sexual violence. One way to do that is by improving early warning systems for sexual violence and other atrocities and proactively pursuing repeat offenders. Peacekeepers in the Congo have set up alert networks that allow communities to report threats and attacks in real time directly to UN peacekeeping bases so they can intervene. And the UN created a special unit in its Congo mission, the Force Intervention Brigade, which has made real headway disarming and defeating the armed groups responsible for some of the worst atrocities, including mass rape. Yet the sad fact is that even when peacekeepers are warned, they often fail to act. A March report by the UN's Internal Oversight Office found that in 507 attacks against civilians from 2000 to 2013, peacekeepers virtually never used force to protect civilians under attack. This is totally unacceptable. To address the problem, the United States is working to ensure peacekeepers have both the capacity and the will to protect civilians under attack. In August, President Obama announced the African Peacekeeping Rapid Response Partnership, or APREP, which will invest $110 million each year for the next 3 to 5 years to build the capabilities of 6 countries, Ethiopia, Ghana, Rwanda, Senegal, Tanzania, and Uganda, which have embraced a more robust approach to peacekeeping. And we are building a global consensus among all peacekeeping countries, including the most skeptical ones, about the critical importance of actually implementing civilian protection mandates, including by protecting women and girls. That is what the short game looks like in stopping sexual violence against women and girls. But of course, if we want to move beyond protecting women and girls from abuses to empowering them to realize their full potential, we need to do much more. It will come as no surprise to you that education is the linchpin of our long game in women's and girls' empowerment. We know that education is a smart investment not only in the girls' future, but also in the future of their nations, as countries that do a better job of educating girls are, on average, more prosperous, healthier, more democratic, and more peaceful. That is not a coincidence. Yet while it is all well and good to say we need to ensure girls' right to an education, and educating girls is one of the smartest investments societies can make, getting girls into the classroom and keeping them there through secondary school takes much more than making school compulsory or building classrooms. Just look at the numbers. 62 million girls worldwide are not in school, more than 30 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is so much promise. To tackle this problem, we need to change the mental models, attitudes, and behaviors that lie beneath this persistent imbalance. For instance, in Tanzania, 4 out of every 10 girls are married before their 18th birthday. That's because, according to a recent report by Human Rights Watch, many communities across the country see marriage as a way to protect girls from premarital sex and pregnancy, both of which are seen as undermining a family's honor. In addition, as we know, brides' families receive dowries from grooms' families, giving them a strong incentive to marry their daughters early. As a result, girls are married off young, forcing many to leave school, and even those who stay in school after marriage are often pressured by school administrators and family members to drop out when they become pregnant. Girls who marry early are more vulnerable to a range of other abuses, including domestic violence and marital rape. It is impossible to ensure more girls in Tanzania find their seats in the classroom and hold on to them without these societies tackling the underlying beliefs and practices that are driving girls from school. That means changing attitudes in communities about child marriage and dowries, and convincing educators to find ways to allow pregnant girls to continue their studies. Behind every one of the obstacles to girls' education is a fear or prejudice that we must address. It is fear of empowered women that drives extremist groups to abduct girls from their classrooms, as they did with the Chibok schoolgirls in Nigeria, and fear that drove them to try to kill this year's remarkable Nobel Prize winner, Malala Yousafzai, for daring to champion girls' right to an education in Pakistan. And it is deep-seated prejudice that causes families to see educating their daughters as less important than educating their sons. The only way to overcome these obstacles to empowerment is to challenge the dangerous idea that a girl's education is a privilege or even a threat, rather than what we know it to be, which is a right. In some instances, changes in the belief systems underlying these practices can be fostered by public policies. In West Bengal, for example, a political affirmative action program put women leaders in village government for the first time. Within 7 years, men's individual bias against the capacity of women leaders almost fully disappeared. Seeing women leaders in positions of authority also gave parents higher aspirations for their daughters, and raise girls' expectations for themselves. And we know full well that the developed world needs public policy oriented around girls' and women's empowerment as well. Last week, Germany passed legislation requiring the country's leading companies to have at least 30% of the membership on their executive boards be held by women, up from the current level of approximately 7%. This in a country led by a female chancellor with a parliament that is approximately 40% female, which is more than double the proportion in the US Congress. When we invest in empowering women and girls, the results come full circle. Women and girls who are better educated can demand more accountable justice systems, which are more effective at prosecuting cases of sexual violence. They will also be better informed about their rights and thus be better equipped to defend them and to demand redress when they are violated. It makes for a virtuous, positive feedback loop. By investing in empowering women and girls, we help create societies where the sexual violence against them is less likely to occur. By playing the long game, we reduce the need to play a short game. Now, I've spoken to you about the importance of looking beyond stopping the current Ebola outbreak to how we can prevent similar outbreaks in the future. And I've spoken about how, in addition to taking immediate steps to end sexual violence, we also need to invest more fully in women's and girls' empowerment. In both instances, the threat in front of us is so urgent and the suffering it causes is so devastating that it can be easy to lose sight of long-term investments. This problem of being consumed by responding to the here and now of a crisis is especially acute with regard to the final threat that I want to discuss, violent extremism. The violence and suffering caused by violent extremist groups calls out for our immediate response, making it particularly challenging to maintain a focus on the long term. In a time when we wonder if we have lost our capacity to feel horror, the barbarism of these groups continues to sicken us. In its vicious campaign against the Yazidi people, ISIL continues to abduct women and girls, hold them captive, and rape them systematically before auctioning them off like cattle at markets. Last week in northern Nigeria, in a series of attacks bearing the hallmarks of Boko Haram, 45 people were killed by 2 suicide bombers in a crowded marketplace, and at least 120 people were killed by bombs and gunmen in an attack on a major mosque. It goes without saying that because terrorist groups like ISIL pose a threat to Americans and to international peace and security, we must rally other nations to confront them. This is why in May, the President launched the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund at West Point to build the capacity of our partners on the front lines in this shared effort, and why the United States has rallied over 60 partners to a global coalition to degrade and defeat ISIL. Many of these partners are already contributing in concrete ways, whether through military support or through addressing the humanitarian catastrophes that ISIL's terror has helped create. Another critical part of responding to this threat is stopping the flow of foreign fighters who increasingly fill the ranks of these extremist groups. Suicide bombers not only from Fallujah, but also from Florida. Fighters not only from Peshawar, but from Paris. It is estimated that more than 16,000 foreign fighters from more than 90 countries have traveled to Syria since the conflict began. 16,000 people. And this includes many people who hold American and EU passports. President Obama has taken the lead in addressing the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. In September, he chaired a UN Security Council summit at the UN on this problem, in which member states committed to taking decisive steps, including stopping the flow of funding and enacting national laws to make it more difficult for these fighters to join such conflicts. But if we do not play the long game in addressing the hatred fueling these groups and the reasons individuals are drawn to their ideology, the waves of extremists will keep coming. Here, Syria offers an important lesson, because when we look at the Syrian conflict, we are reminded that ISIL's barbarism has been fueled by the barbarism of the Assad regime, a regime whose ongoing atrocities continue to be ISIL's most fertile recruiting tool. A regime that during Ramadan calibrated its bombing runs to coincide with the times and places where Muslims were meeting to break the fast. A regime that dropped chemical weapons and barrel bombs on unarmed civilians. A regime that is responsible for torturing thousands of detainees and documenting their torment in harrowing photographs, whose victims were given serial numbers. And their torture, starvation, and killings meticulously documented. So those who argue that we must work with the Assad regime to vanquish the threat of ISIL are wrong-headed about this being productive for American interests. Not only would partnering with Assad go against what America stands for and believes in, it would be a huge boon for extremism in the region and the world. In Syria, the enemy of our enemy is not and will never be our friend. The lesson to be drawn from the Syrian conflict is one that can be applied far beyond its borders. Extremism thrives in places where people have no hope, where brutality is systematized, where impunity is endemic. Extremism grows in dark places where there is no hope or light to let other ambitions grow. Tackling violent extremism also requires lifting up the voices of Muslims and people of all faiths who denounce terrorist acts committed in the name of Islam. In September, 126 Muslim scholars sent a letter to the head of ISIL saying, "It is forbidden in Islam to kill the innocent. It is forbidden in Islam to kill emissaries, ambassadors, and diplomats. Hence, it is forbidden to kill journalists and aid workers. It is forbidden in Islam to harm or mistreat in any way Christians or any people of the Scripture. It is obligatory to consider the Yazidis as people of the Scripture. The reintroduction of slavery is forbidden in Islam." Now, I didn't hear about this letter when it came out, and chances are neither did you, and neither did so many people, particularly in the Muslim world, to whom the letter is also directed. I first heard about it a few weeks ago when the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Rad al-Hussein, also a Muslim, read it before the Security Council. He also told the Council of ISIL's attacks, quote, "The authors of these crimes are people whose actions are nothing but disgusting and whose consciences have demonstrably been annihilated," end quote. More messages like the clerics and like the High Commissioners need to be heard. In addition to lifting up the voices of Muslims who denounce terrorism, we also have to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. The facility should never have been opened in the first place and continues to make us less safe and to undermine our standing in the world. Years ago, the Supreme Court rejected the premise for opening Gitmo, which was that detainees would not be able to challenge their detention. The vast majority of detainees once held at Guantanamo have been transferred, including 530 transferred under the previous administration. As a U.S. diplomat, I can't tell you how often other governments point to Gitmo as a way of defending their repressive practices, or how much its sustained existence continues to weigh on our relationships with close partners and allies. And extremist groups continue to use Guantanamo as a propaganda tool to recruit those who seek to do us harm and as a justification for their abhorrent violence. President Obama has made clear his desire to close Guantanamo, but since 2009, Congress has imposed restrictions that have constrained our ability to do so, including placing limits on our ability to transfer detainees to foreign countries and imposing a prohibition on transferring detainees to the United States, even those we have the capacity to effectively prosecute for their crimes. Another argument should not be necessary, but please listen to this one. The United States is spending nearly $500 million annually to operate the detention facility, which currently holds 142 detainees. That works out to roughly $3 million per detainee per year, or approximately 30 times what it costs to hold a prisoner in a federal supermax prison, the kind of facility from which no prisoner has ever escaped. That same $500 million could be spent training nurses to stop the spread of Ebola in West Africa, or investing in girls' education in Nigeria or Afghanistan, or strengthening aviation security and information sharing tools to track down foreign terrorist fighters, or any of the other long-term investments, domestic or international, that too often get short shrift. Now, at times, it can feel as though the United States is shouldering an unfair burden in responding to global threats, and that the American people are the only ones being asked to make sacrifices to try to ensure a more secure and stable world. But we are not. We live in a world full of people willing to put everything on the line for the future of their families, their nations, and by extension, for the world that we share. That dedication is what drove so many of the young Liberians, Guineans, and Sierra Leoneans that I met on my recent trip, people risking their lives as well as alienation from their communities by volunteering to serve in the Ebola treatment centers and in the burial teams. As one young volunteer told me in Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, quote, "If we leave our brothers and sisters to die, who knows, it might be us next. It is a point of duty," end quote. It is what continues to drive schoolgirls in northern Nigeria to show up to class every day, girls who are not willing to let the fear of seeing other girls kidnapped by extremists keep them from claiming their right to an education. And it is what drove the fearless Libyan human rights defender, Salwa Bugayas, to stand up for the rights of her people despite constant death threats, first under the Gaddafi regime and later from extremists. On June 25, 2014, Salwa urged her fellow Libyans not to be intimidated by extremists who had threatened to attack anyone who voted in parliamentary elections. She even posted photos of herself casting her ballot on her Facebook page to show that she would not be cowed by the death threats she had received or by fear. She was killed that night. All of these people, the Jacksons and the Salwas and the Nigerian schoolgirls and so many others, are our partners in the long game. And they have high expectations, not just for themselves, but for us. They believe that the United States will live up to our highest principles by standing with them. They believe that we will prove worthy of wielding the tremendous responsibility that comes with our tremendous power. That we will not only play the long game because it is in our self-interest, which it is, but because we believe it is right to advance the dignity of people around the world, which it is. It is and must be a constant struggle for all of us to live up to these expectations and to live up to these principles. In the United States and abroad, people recognize that this is a struggle that the American people have embraced and that we who have the privilege of representing them must embrace as well. It is the constant struggle that makes us who we are. It is why our partners and the world expect so much of us, and that is not a burden that weighs us down. It is a wind that lifts us up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jeff Brenzel. I'm the master of Timothy Dwight College and the steward of the Chubb Fellowship. And knowing the stress and strain of Ambassador Power's work, not to mention the relentless sense of urgency that rises up to meet her every day, I'm both impressed and grateful that she came today to participate in a class here with Paul Gewirtz, Jake Sullivan, and Harold Coe, has stayed to give this University Chubb Fellowship address, and we'll have dinner later with 120 undergraduates.
Don't forget the reception.
And the reception. I like what she said then about the long game. Hendon Chubb and the many prior Chubb Fellows would applaud her investment here today in you and in us. I hope she will see a return on the investment, both from those inside and those outside this room. We're privileged to have her here. We're privileged in general. And that privilege brings its obligations. Let's hope that we can seize our opportunities in the ways that she has seized hers. So let's have a few questions. You see two microphones here in the aisle. If you have a question, please make your way to those microphones now. Some of you are positioned advantageously for this. Because time is short, please do your best to speak briefly and ask a clear question. Okay, thanks very much. And Nicola, because you're a TD student, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Power. A recent profile of you in the Vogue magazine has your friend and a former colleague of yours saying, people with Samantha's moral compass and compassion don't usually make it to such ranks of power. My question follows on from that. I've always respected your ability to criticize governments and other bodies both abroad and at home in the US. But your position now as a representative for the US requires, I assume, that you defend and promote the US's the position of the US. even when it might be against or different to your own personal position, or even when it is criticized by other human rights organizations. I wanted to know if you could please speak to the challenges of holding such a position with such constraints versus, say, being an independent journalist.
Great, thank you.
Easy one.
Yeah, I was hoping when the question started by quoting Vogue, I was hoping we were trending in a good direction, but let me just, I think the best way to answer it is just to describe the blessing that I feel every day being, particularly in the job that I'm in now, getting to represent the United States. I'm an Irish immigrant to this country, getting to sit in front of the placard, having the weight of our diplomatic resources and our means and our soft power behind me every day on behalf of the same causes I championed my entire life, from the basement of Beinecke Library or wherever I was working on a given day. I mean, in the old days, when I wrote a column, for instance, I used to have a column at Time Magazine, or if I wrote a long New Yorker piece, my hope was that someone at a much lower level than mine now would read that and would bring it into the meetings and try to inject a perspective from the field, from the way, from people who could speak to the ways in which policies were affecting real people far from, as it were, the boardroom or far from the bureaucracy. So I just feel incredibly privileged to be able to take that perspective. And I'll just give you a couple examples of how I think bridging those worlds can be really powerful and important. One I mentioned already, Jackson Nema. The Security Council occasionally brings in people from outside UN officialdom, but relatively rarely still. And when we did this meeting for the first, again, emergency meeting on a public health crisis in the 70-year history of the UN, there'd been a really important AIDS Security Council meeting before, but to think, how do you puncture what people are bringing, the pre-existing alibis and biases and indifference, or even concern, but misinformation or whatever that people are bringing to this meeting, and to find a Liberian health worker who actually was the person at the gates having to turn people away because there just weren't enough beds, and for him to describe what it was like to tell a father that no, he could not deposit his child in the council. If I have the chance as the UN ambassador to bring Jackson's voice into UN Security Council deliberations, which are usually, a little more robotic, I mean, that is, and if the price is simply that having argued for something internally and not succeeded, that I, get to go out and still defend the U.S., I mean, that's a very modest price to pay. Another example is the Obama administration pushed hard to try to get the crimes in Syria referred to the International Criminal Court. And Russia cast its fourth veto in the Syria context over that issue. And, when I was sitting down with my team to think about how can we capture the stakes of this, and this is not a story of success from a policy standpoint, but nonetheless, there are all of these people out there in Syria who've been barrel bombed by this regime, have been tortured, have been gassed with sarin, and now with this veto that's coming tomorrow, the Russians it will prevent those crimes from ever being, or for the time being anyway, being adjudicated or prosecuted in court. So we tracked down a chemical weapons survivor, and I was able to say to the council and to my Russian colleague and Chinese colleague who also vetoed, unfortunately, because of these vetoes today, the ICC will not be able to hear the testimony of people who survived the chemical weapons attacks. It would be left to a court normally to decide what is true and what is false. But here is the testimony of one person who would have liked to testify. And I just, in his own voice, basically described what had happened to him, and we ended up being able to bring him into the Security Council chamber. And he and others, again, it's small compared to the veto, which was so devastating, but that, to be able to inject that perspective into deliberations, again, is a privilege of a lifetime. Compared to writing a column and, again, hoping someone will read my column, I take this any day.
In thinking about the long run, is U.S. diplomacy doing anything to separate the followers from the leadership of the terrorist group and somehow welcoming them back into civil society?
It's an excellent question. I mean, I think that there are a number of programs now that exist, including a very noteworthy one in the UAE, which is for people who have chosen to leave violent extremist groups. And I think thinking through not only the pressure side of the equation, namely what are the disincentives, what are the rewards that can be placed for the arrest or capture of individuals who are behind very nefarious plotting, but thinking about how to pull away those followers, whether through social media and places that they're very, very active to try to, right now the terrorists in ISIL have taken significant advantage of social media platforms. And it's really important that we who are trying to contest that message, but not just we, the kinds of clerics that I described in my remarks, that they are taking advantage of those platforms as well and pulling them away. So we're drawing on everything in the Department of Homeland Security, in the Department of Justice, across the U.S. government in terms of the State Department and our public diplomacy to try to project messages of the kind that you're describing, which is that there is a place to go, and that you're not, that at a certain point you're not too far gone. On the other hand, if people have been part of executing American journalists and the kinds of horrors that have been perpetrated in Syria and Iraq, we also have a responsibility, particularly to American citizens, to pursue prosecution and so forth. So, I think separating out people who have been instrumental in violent acts against civilians from those who sort of thought it might be a cool idea to go to Syria for, their school break and then got stuck there. We need a way and to continue to strengthen the ways of distinguishing.
Ambassador, could you comment on the United Nations Conference on Climate Change that is starting this week in Lima, Peru, and also give us your projection as to how the result of that conference might be implemented by the President and by the Congress?
Thank you. Well, one of the reasons that President Obama and the Chinese Premier made the announcement that they did when they did was to try to inject into that conference momentum out of the bilateral agreement that we reached with China. And I will say now, as somewhat of a veteran of multilateral diplomacy, having worked on it for 4+ years at the White House and now been in my current job for more than a year, often the best ingredient for successful multilateral diplomacy is strong bilateral agreements that then amalgamate. And so, for the United States and China to make commitments of that nature, not only in terms of emissions reductions as the two largest economies, as the two major emitters, but also for the United States to make such a substantial commitment on the funding side for those countries that are already feeling the effects of climate change. I mean, there's just the cost, and I hear this from small island countries at the UN. It's as poignant as hearing about abuses carried out in peacekeeping. I mean, it's just hearing whole villages disappear, livelihoods eradicated, and so forth. So we attempted to bring that momentum into Peru. I'm not going to make any predictions because these conferences are very hard to predict, but we have a number of bites at the apple between now and the ultimate goal for something more comprehensive. Thank you.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for giving such a convincing argument for why the United States should play a role in supporting liberty and freedom in the world. But my question is that you talked a lot about the, if not for test and evaluating humanitarian interventions. And a lot of these wars, like Iraq and some of the other ones, have been billed as humanitarian, have given humanitarianism a bad name, and have made the American people understandably frustrated with excursions, foreign excursions. So can you explain how you think will you and the government in general, or the Obama administration or future administrations, can convince people, or convince the American people that the United States has a role to play in the world beyond just protecting its national security?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to pull apart the like and the unlike, and try. It's very challenging to do this, but try to distinguish one particular set of circumstances from another. So, for instance, the circumstances that existed prior to the war in Iraq back in 2003 were ones that President Obama then, of course not president, but nonetheless did not find convincing as warranting the deployment of U.S. forces and an intervention without Security Council authorization, and a lot of the sort of foreseen negative international reaction, which I believe, as he put it at the time, was going to have implications on the back end also for how much support one would get in sort of seeing through the mission. That is a very different set of circumstances from the set of circumstances where ISIL, a group that makes very explicit its genocidal intention toward Shia, toward Christians, toward Yazidi, forcing people to convert, raping people, enslaving people, executing American journalists who they know have done no harm other than to try and document the suffering of the Syrian people. So drawing those distinctions, yes, it turns out there are military operations in both instances in Iraq, but there are also substantial difference in terms of the imminent threat posed by, in the case of the current effort, by something that we haven't seen before, which is a terrorist movement controlling large swaths of territory and massive heavy weaponry, much of which and oil fields, right? I mean, so again, just to isolate both the intentions, the actions, and the resources and capabilities of this movement, and make the case on those grounds. And I think, notwithstanding the very, very understandable fatigue in this country from being involved in war for so long in Iraq and Afghanistan, the public support for this effort against ISIL, I think, speaks to the fact that that distinction was drawn and that people accept that these are two different circumstances. It doesn't mean that they're not concerned, that they don't raise issues that have to be taken very, very seriously about, ending up in a different place. But in terms of this, campaign in support of Iraqi efforts to roll back ISIL's gains and ultimately degrade and defeat ISIL, there's a lot of support. The other thing we need to do, though, that I tried to do a little bit tonight, but we need to do more of, is when something is working, as for instance our intervention in Liberia is working. It's not succeeded. It's not close to having succeeded, but it is having measurable, demonstrable effects for families in Liberia, and ultimately having important effects also for the security of the American people. We need to be sure that we are communicating that effectively to the American people. It is unfortunate, and somebody who has maybe some bandwidth to do this can look at this, but the amount of coverage that the Ebola epidemic got in the period before our interventions in Liberia started to take effect versus the amount of coverage, again, it's normal, but it's not desirable from the standpoint of the American people actually knowing the return on the investment that they are getting by virtue of what our heroic forces and CDC epidemiologists and aid workers and diplomats are doing. So we have to tell that story, and I try to do that wherever I can. But that's a part, I think, of ensuring that the American people have confidence not only that we have the right objective as the government, but also that we have the ability to achieve the objectives that we lay out. And that confidence is an important part of sustaining our international engagement.
Okay, I'm going to apologize for the folks that have been standing in line because I think we're going to be able to do 2 more questions. So
Why don't we hear from everyone, and I'll just take a couple of them, but at least your
right.
fellow audience members will have heard from them.
All right, rapid fire.
Rapid fire.
Oh God, no pressure. You spoke a little bit about how important it is for the United States to partner with other nations to promote peace and security. How do you deal with the challenge of balancing trying to cooperate with countries like Russia or China that we agree with on some issues and want to work with, but then on the issue of Syria or in Ukraine or the conflicts in the South China Sea, we diverge? How do you balance those 2 different issues?
Yes.
After hearing you talk about the obstacles to women's education outside the U.S., I can't help but just feel, amazingly lucky to get to go to school, at all, and especially at a place like this. And I'm wondering if, given all the experiential learning that has happened for you between the time you graduated Yale and where you are now, is there anything you learned here, either academically or socially, that's really made an impact in how you do your job?
I'm wondering if you can comment on the future of the responsibility to protect doctrine, given the challenges of intervening in Syria.
2 great historical events in my life. When I met my wife, that was the number 1. And number 2, the formation of the United Nations. Can you give us some idea of what's going on to make the United Nations a more efficient and organization in terms of reforms of various types?
I appreciated your words about global threats requiring global cooperation in the context of Ebola or fighting the threat from returning foreign fighters. And I'm wondering what you think in the next few decades will be the challenges, limits, and benefits of empowering regional partnerships, not just the US and India or direct bilateral relations for things like the climate deal, but directly empowering regional powers to be presences in their regions and to deal with some of the problems and issues and guide in ways that the US may not be able to or willing to in the next coming decades.
First of all, I wanted to say thank you because I know you're a big inspiration to me and probably many in this room. I've heard world fellow Ramni Nakla, who's an activist in Syria, speak frequently this semester about the nature of the ISIS problem being not just something that's a short-term solution, but as you said, long game, and something that relates very strongly to the power vacuum in Syria. So I was wondering if you could talk more about what the frontier is on that issue, because most of what I've heard is very cynical and that it's just something that's going on. But I know that you've written, obviously, about how America responds in the age of genocide and what you think the next step is.
So you spoke a little bit about how Islam does not support the actions of ISIS. So I was wondering why we're still calling it ISIS and rewarding it by branding it with the name, of a religion that supports, that's a good religion with good people. So it's just, thank you.
Ambassador, thank you for being here.
They would have us call it Islamic State. They would have us call it, that is their current title for themselves. But anyway, go ahead, sorry.
With the Millennium Development Goals set to expire and the Sustainable Development Goals being next on the agenda, I'm wondering what you see as the greatest challenge in those negotiations and which countries the United States is going to need to engage to achieve its objectives.
Thank you so much for being here, Ambassador. Given that 2015 is the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, I'm wondering what your feelings are on how the UN will approach that and whether this will be a time to bring up more or less publicity about genocide in general and whether this anniversary is an important thing for Americans to also be aware of, given that there's a large Armenian population, but also given the many other genocides that have happened since that time.
Hi, my question is more about your background. You were a journalist, and you were had just graduated from Yale when the Yugoslavian genocide began. You saw the Rwandan genocide, and you saw the UN system fail. And now, as being part of that system, how does that inform your role in the UN, particularly with intervention?
Thank you so much for being here. My own studies have focused on gender promotion in Rwanda, which have been, to a degree, successful through a combination of the country's size, political will, and the fact that it's post-conflict. Of course, you look at places like the DRC, where violence and conflict themselves have become endemic. How do you combat kind of gender-based violence in those situations? Thank you.
My question is about genocide also. I count probably two major instances in the current administration of the word genocide being used very publicly and very impactfully in Benghazi, and then earlier this year surrounding the Yazidis in Iraq. And I would like you to just maybe briefly give a little retrospective grading on the administration's use of that term and whether it kind of fits in the model that you would think is appropriate for the use of that term, and whether or not you think it's maybe broader than just one president or one administration, and if it reflects a broader institutional change by the US government and the way it uses that term and how that term is used to affect broader action in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I just want to question, how can the US, alongside the United Nations, block any future military intervention, military kind of, I would say, a war kind of between the Israelis and the Palestinians? How can we block a future Israeli raid on Gaza and killing civilians? Thank you.
So, Ambassador Power, I'm going to be deeply impressed by the way that you pulled this off.
No, you won't be.
And I know that in advance. And also, I think we've got enough material here for another visit next week, don't you think?
Okay, first let me say one reason I think that was the right thing to do is just what an amazing group of students. Definitely the standards have gone up since they let me in. So there's not one of those questions I would have been capable of asking when I was here as an undergrad, but nonetheless, now I'm stuck answering them. So what I think I'll do is just, I'm actually not going to try to tick on each of them, but I want to just say a few words about the issues that haven't come up yet so far, and then just encourage those students. I don't recall exactly where we're going next, but we have some next on the Grateful Dead tour. We're making our way to the next venue, and then people who don't feel I was responsive to their question, I'm more than happy to engage. But one, because I think it's a question, the very first question, one about how we continue to work every day with Russia, notwithstanding Ukraine and Syria and these very divisive issues. I think it's just a question that's been on a lot of people's minds, so I'll take that question. I think the answer is that each of us, that the United States and Russia, each have interests that we want to see advanced. In Syria, for instance, our interests that are very much overlapping, should be overlapping with Russia's, preventing foreign terrorist fighters flow, preventing terrorist groups from gaining a foothold, preventing chemical weapons use. Those are our interests, and those are why we have taken the policy positions that we have, very much alongside preventing the slaughter of innocent families, which is happening every day. Russia has at least some of those shared interests, but their route to advancing those interests is very distinct from ours, and that is what creates the clash that we have seen and the vetoes that I've mentioned. In other words, they view Assad as the route to achieving many of the objectives that I've described, and sort of just accepting his rule in perpetuity as being in our collective interests, which they would characterize. But at the same time, we are in gridlock in the Security Council over Syria. We are working side by side in the P5+1 negotiations to try to come up with a comprehensive deal that would deny Iran a pathway to a nuclear weapon. And Russia has participated constructively in that. By the same token, on many, many Africa issues, whether South Sudan or the Central African Republic or Mali, issues where their immediate interests may not be at stake, but they still vote in support of peacekeeping operations or in support even of sanctions designations and so forth. So there's a fair amount of cooperation on issues not related to Syria and Ukraine that goes on in New York, and it's very useful for our interest that that is the case. Our cooperation in the Security Council will never lead us to pull our punches, however, on human rights abuses inside Russia and the kind of overt, brazen aggression that we've seen in Ukraine. So there are tensions in all of that, as you can imagine. In terms of just flagging a couple other things that hadn't come up, I think the Millennium Development Goals is something that a lot of students on campus were interested in and got a lot of traction. These goals for kids being in school, for malaria, for a whole host of social and economic goods, and they've had a stickiness, particularly in the health area, that has been very, very important. Our biggest challenge in negotiating the successor goals to the MDGs is the success of the MDGs, because these goals became actionable and resources have been deployed around a set of goals, measurable targets. If you have an issue that matters to you and you're in this negotiation, you want that issue represented in the new set of goals because you believe that it will mean that you get the resources that you need. And every country is bringing this kind of attitude to it. In other words, the stakes are seen as extremely high, but the result right now is a very, very long list, and he who fights every battle risks fighting none. So the biggest challenge is, because of the success, perversely, of the MDGs and the faith that people have injected in this new process, it will be challenging, very challenging, to discipline the list. The last thing I'd say, just in terms of what I learned academically or socially, I think I learned nothing socially, that's for sure. But I would say, I mean, the amazing thing about being at Yale was opening up. We used to have this thing. This is ridiculous that this is no longer the case, but we used to have the Blue Book, and opening up the Blue Book.
It's still there.
Yeah, but it's online. It doesn't count. It's nowhere near the same. But it's just this. It would come, and it was this amazing, euphoric experience where your eyes were so much bigger than your tummy, and you wanted to take everything and learn everything and inject yourself into a whole host of domains that you had no business being in some cases. But I think that's the spirit, that spirit of believing that you can both learn, which can be a burden, it's hard, particularly in competitive environments like this one, and love it. I think that is the thing that I took from here, and I've just been extremely privileged in my professional career to constantly learn and also just love it and bring that expectation every day that we can be inspired by our work, and even if we're not succeeding always in just the way we'd like, that to have the privilege of trying is just a great, great blessing. So the Blue Book spirit that I take to my day job, I think, is what I would share. Anyway, with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.